The first thing that hit the floor was a ceramic pot filled with white gardenias. It didn't just fall. It was swept off the counter by the arm of a man who had never once been told his anger had consequences. The pot cracked against the tile, dirt spreading across the floor like a dark stain. Then a second one followed. Then a row of glass vases toppling one after another. Water soaked into the petals of freshly cut peonies. A bucket of lilies tipped sideways, spilling across the entrance. By the time Jae-won turned around to leave, half the interior of Bennett Bloom's looked like a storm had moved through it. And through all of it, Amara Bennett said nothing. She stood behind the ruined counter, both hands pressed flat against the wood, watching him with an expression that wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was something quieter than both of those things. And that silence unnerved Jae-won far more than any raised voice would have. He pushed through the door without looking back. Jae-won was 38 years old and had spent the better part of a decade controlling the most dangerous corridors of the city. He didn't just run operations. He owned people, territories, entire networks of loyalty built on fear and precision. Old rivals, street-level bosses, men who had once refused to bend, all of them had eventually yielded to him. People called him ruthless. His lieutenants called him untouchable. Nobody called him kind. And he had never once lost sleep over that. The block he wanted was supposed to be his next move, a prime city location he intended to launder clean and convert into a legitimate real estate front, the kind of investment that turned dirty money into something his accountants could present to a board. The project had taken years to plan. Every property on that block had been quietly acquired. Every owner had been persuaded, one way or another, except one. Bennett Bloom sat wedged between two aging brick buildings like something that had simply refused to move. A small flower shop with a hand-painted sign, a weathered wooden door, and window boxes overflowing with seasonal color. Jae-won had sent 3 offer letters before he ever set foot inside the place. Market value, then double, then 4 times that, a number that would have set anyone up comfortably for life. Each time, Amara declined, not with a counter-offer, not with a lawyer's letter, just a polite handwritten note thanking him for his interest and explaining that the shop was not available. His people had been clear. The acquisition could not move forward until that parcel was secured. Every week of delay was exposure he couldn't afford. And so Jae-won decided he would go himself, because in his experience, things that resisted him simply hadn't yet been confronted directly enough. When he walked into the shop that morning, he wasn't prepared for what it felt like inside. It was small, yes, but the light came through the windows in long, warm angles, catching the dust motes floating above buckets of fresh-cut flowers. The smell was overwhelming in the best way, green and sweet and alive. For just a moment, standing in the doorway, something in Jae-won's chest loosened slightly. An old memory tried to surface. He pushed it down. He placed the contract on the counter and slid it toward her. "Name your price," he said. "Whatever number makes sense to you, I'll match it. I just need this resolved." Amara looked at the contract, then back at him. She was a beautiful black woman with dark eyes and the kind of calm that comes from having made peace with something a long time ago. "I appreciate that," she said. "But this shop isn't for sale. Everything has a price. Not this." Her voice didn't waver. "My grandmother built this place. She gave 40 years of her life to it. This isn't a transaction for me. This is the only thing I have left of her." Jae-won felt the patience he'd walked in with beginning to dissolve. "Your grandmother is gone," he said. And even as he said it, he knew how cold it sounded. "The building is old. The neighborhood is changing whether you want it to or not. I'm offering you the chance to walk away with enough money to build something new anywhere you want." "I don't want something new," Amara said quietly. "I want this." Something in him broke loose. It wasn't one feeling. It was several months of frustration colliding at once. He thought about his lieutenants waiting, the pressure from above, the timeline that had a clock running on it. He thought about every obstacle that had ever stood between him and what he was building, and how every single one of them had eventually moved. His arms swept across the display shelf without him fully deciding to do it. Pots crashed, vases shattered, water hit the floor in cold splashes. He kept going, a row of flower arrangements, a standing display near the window. By the time he stopped, the shop was wrecked, and he was breathing hard, and the only sound was a single stem still rolling slowly across the wet tile. Amara knelt down. She didn't cry. She didn't scream at him. She simply picked up one flower at a time and set it carefully aside, as though she was going to need them later, as though she still intended to open tomorrow. Jae-won stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked out. He was in his car and 3 blocks away before his hands stopped shaking. 3 hours later, he stood in a hospital corridor and felt the floor shift beneath him. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always do, clean in a way that doesn't comfort you. Jae-won visited his mother every Tuesday and Thursday. It had become a ritual over the past 2 months, ever since his mother had come closer to dying than he ever let himself fully process. She was 71 years old, sharp-minded and stubborn in exactly the way Jae-won had inherited. And she had been in that hospital bed long enough that the nurses knew her by name and had memorized how she took her tea. The disease had moved fast. Her doctors had been blunt. Without a very specific medical procedure, and without a donor who matched a narrow and unusual set of biological criteria, she would not survive the year. Jae-won had paid for every specialist money could reach. He'd had his entire extended family tested. None of them were compatible. The search had gone out through quiet channels, medical networks, discreet outreach. For 3 weeks, nothing. And then with almost no warning, someone came forward. A donor, anonymous, perfect match. The procedure was successful. His mother recovered steadily, and the identity of the person who had saved her remained sealed, because that donor had made one request above all others. They did not want to be found. His mother talked about this person sometimes, not obsessively, but with the specific tenderness of someone who had been handed their life back by a stranger. Someone decided I was worth saving, she would say. And they didn't even stay to be thanked. Jae-won had always found it moving. He had also privately spent considerable effort trying to identify who that person was, through hospital administrators, through every channel available to him, and had come up empty each time. That Tuesday evening, he arrived later than usual. He sat in the chair beside his mother's bed while she slept and tried not to think about the flower shop. He wasn't succeeding. The image of Amara kneeling on that wet tile floor kept returning to him with an insistence that felt almost physical. He had destroyed things before, rivals, deals, old buildings. He had never felt like this afterward. A nurse came in quietly to update the medical chart on the desk. She set down a folder and left without disturbing his mother. Jae-won glanced at it without meaning to. Medical files didn't interest him. He looked away, then looked back. Part of the folder had slipped open. It was a follow-up document from the donor procedure, a routine file clipped together with an administrative form, and at the back, a photograph attached for identity verification purposes. Jae-won leaned forward. He recognized her immediately. The dark eyes, the calm expression, the beautiful face he had been watching kneel quietly on a flower shop floor not 4 hours earlier. Amara Bennett. He sat back in the chair so hard it scraped against the floor. His mother stirred slightly, then stilled. Jae-won stared at the ceiling for a long time. When the nurse returned, he asked her carefully to explain what that document was. She hesitated, then explained that the photo was part of a standard post-procedure identity file. The donor had been an individual who had come to the hospital on an unrelated errand. She had overheard medical staff discussing a patient who had an unusual need for a specific donor type. At that time, the hospital had been quietly running a voluntary compatibility screening for anyone willing. Very few people had volunteered. This woman had. The odds of a match were very small. Against all reasonable probability, Amara was a perfect match. She had agreed to the procedure without hesitation. She had refused any form of compensation. Her only condition, held to firmly and in writing, was that the patient and the patient's family never be told who she was. She said, the nurse offered almost gently, that she didn't want gratitude. She just wanted someone to live. Jae-won sat in that hospital room for a very long time after the nurse left. He thought about his mother. He thought about the day they'd gotten the call that a donor had been found, the way he had pressed his face into his hands and allowed himself privately to come apart with relief. He thought about the fact that somewhere across the city, a woman had been going through a medical procedure for a complete stranger without telling anyone, and had then come home to her flower shop and arranged flowers in the window the very next morning. He thought about the vases he had knocked off her counter. He thought about the way she had knelt on the floor and picked the stems up one by one. The guilt arrived slowly at first, then all at once. Jae-won had built his world on being the most decisive man in every room. He made fast decisions and he stood behind them. He did not second-guess himself. He did not owe explanations. These were not poses. They were deeply held beliefs about how power worked and what it required. But sitting in that hospital room beside the woman whose life had been quietly saved by the same woman he had gone out of his way to humiliate, every conviction he'd walked in with that morning fell thin and poorly made. He pulled out his phone. He sat with it in his hand for a while. Then he put it away. Some things couldn't be handled by phone. He went back to the shop the next morning. The door was already open. The damage was exactly as he'd left it. Jae-won had half expected her to board the place up overnight, or at the very least to put a sign in the window. Instead, Amara was sweeping the floor when he arrived, gathering the last of the broken ceramic pieces into a dustpan with the methodical attention of someone who had already decided to move forward, regardless of how she felt. She looked up when the door opened. Her expression didn't change much. She just watched him. Jae-won had prepared something on the drive over, a careful, measured explanation of what he had discovered, followed by a sincere apology, followed by a concrete offer to make it right. He was good at structured conversations. They kept him in control of outcomes. He lost the structure almost immediately. "I was at the hospital last night," he said. "My mother's hospital." He stopped, started again. "There was a file. A donor file. I saw your photograph." Amara set the broom against the wall. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she looked away toward the window, and he could see that she was working out how to respond. Not with shock, but with something that looked more like resignation. Like she had known on some level that this conversation would eventually find her. "I wasn't supposed to see it," Jae-won said. "It was an accident. But I need you to know. I need you to understand that I know what you did. And I know what I did yesterday, and those two things don't fit together in any way that makes me look like anything other than exactly what I was." Amara folded her arms loosely across her chest. "You didn't know," she said. "That doesn't fix it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He offered to rebuild the shop. He told her he'd cover every repair, every replacement, every stem and pot and display case. He told her he'd pay beyond what the damage warranted. He told her the acquisition could be restructured, that he wasn't sure how yet, but that he would find a way to make it work without requiring her to leave. She listened to all of it. Then she said quietly, "I don't want your money." He started to respond and she held up one hand. "I saved your mother because someone needed saving," she said. "Not because of who she was. I didn't know who she was at the time. I just knew she needed help and I was in a position to give it. That's the only reason." She paused. "And what you did yesterday was wrong. But I don't need it compensated. I just need you to leave this place alone." Jae-won left. And then he did something that people who knew him would have found genuinely confusing. He changed the plan, not incrementally, not with minor adjustments. He called his lead contact that same afternoon and told him the footprint of the project was being revised. The Bennett Blooms parcel was no longer part of the acquisition. The design would have to be reworked around it. His people told him it would cost him. He answered them all with the same response. "It's already decided." 6 months later, the development opened on a clear morning in early autumn. The towers were exactly as grand as he'd envisioned. The courtyard fountains ran perfectly. The space filled quickly and drew attention from across the city. And right at the center of it all, surrounded by all of that steel and glass and intention, stood one small building with a hand-painted sign and window boxes and a wooden door propped open to let in the morning air. The entire courtyard layout had been redesigned to draw foot traffic past the shop's entrance. The development literally curved around it. Several people noted the design choice, calling it unusual and quietly interesting. Jaewon never explained why. On opening day, his mother came. She walked slowly on Jaewon's arm through the courtyard. He had told her a version of the story. Not all of it, not yet. Enough that she understood who Amara was before she walked through the door. Inside the shop, his mother looked around at the flowers with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned not to rush through things that are beautiful. Then her gaze drifted to the counter where a framed photograph sat, a younger Amara beside an elderly woman with white hair and an expression of unmistakable warmth. His mother went very still. "That's Mrs. Bennett," she said. Jaewon looked at her. His mother turned away from the photograph slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, lower, unsteady in the way that only old memories can make a voice. She told him something she had never mentioned before. Decades ago, when Jaewon's father had died young and left them with almost nothing, she had hit a stretch of winter that almost swallowed her whole. One afternoon, she collapsed from cold and exhaustion on a sidewalk. And the woman who found her, who brought her inside, fed her, sat with her, and refused every attempt to pay her back, was the owner of a small flower shop. When his mother left that day, the woman pressed a small bouquet into her hands and said, "Kindness always comes back around." Jaewon looked at Amara. Amara had been listening from across the counter. She didn't look surprised. She almost looked relieved, like a long-held thing had finally been set down. "She told me that story many times," Amara said. "When I heard your mother's name at the hospital, I recognized it." She straightened a stem in the nearest arrangement, something to do with her hands. It wasn't charity. It was just returning something that had been given a long time ago. His mother didn't speak for a moment. Then she placed a bouquet on the counter, the way you place something carefully, with full intention. "Your grandmother planted something here," she said. "A long time ago." Amara smiled. "Small and real. Flowers always bloom again." Outside, through the window, Jaewon could see his development, the towers and the fountains, and the people moving through the space he'd spent years building. All of it exactly as he'd imagined it. And one thing more, a small wooden door propped open at the center of it all. For the first time, the smallest building there meant the most. Because it wasn't built on power. It was built on generations of kindness. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness has a longer memory than we think. And if you're new here, subscribe. More stories like this one are waiting for you.